Let's talk to Mike Buckley, who's a journalist and campaigner, and also to Georgia Gilholy, who is a political reporter with politics.co.uk. You're both very welcome to Talk Radio this morning. Thanks for making the time. Mike, perhaps I can ask you first, why do you think things are so tricky for Boris Johnson, and is there a way out for him?
Well, the Conservatives wanted him as leader because they thought he could win, and he's proven twice this year that he can't win in true blue Tory areas, so North Shropshire this week and Cheshire and Amersham earlier in the year, and indeed they struggled in a couple of other by-elections as well. And on top of that, his own personal ratings, if you look at the polling, have fallen through the floor, and the ratings for the Conservative Party as a whole are not looking that good either. So given his party, and we know they like a winner anyway, they particularly wanted Boris Johnson, not because they particularly trusted him or liked his character, but because they thought he could win in parts of the country that the Conservative leaders couldn't. If it looks like he's lost that quality, they will get rid of him like a shot. And I think the most dangerous thing from it at the moment is it's not just the opposition calling for him to go, it's some of his own MPs calling for him to go, and others putting him on notice and saying, if you don't improve, you'll be gone 12 months from now.
Georgia, what do you make of that? MPs calling for him to go. The ones I've heard speaking publicly, certainly Sir Roger Gale and so on, only saying, he's on his it's the last chance saloon. I think Ruth Davidson said yesterday, she's not an MP obviously, but a member of the House of Lords, long-time critic of Boris Johnson, of course, as is Sir Roger Gale and a few other people as well. But he has been a winner previously. It's hard to believe it's only been just over 2 years, literally a week ago, 2 years ago, that Boris Johnson won an 80-strong majority on the promise of getting Brexit done. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, gosh, time flies clearly when you're in a pandemic. And I think one of the reasons why Boris is possibly not out the door, in the next few weeks, even though arguably he's done enough to merit being pushed out at this point, I think it's because there's really no obvious successor right now in the Conservative Party for the premiership. I think that obviously we know people like Liz Truss and obviously Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, have been sort of putting out feelers, but I don't think they would sort of individually have enough support yet to sort of get rid of Boris, basically, because the problem is, as you're saying, there are people like Sir Roger Gale, for example, Ruth Davidson, people who have always been more, let's say, on the Liberal side of the Conservative Party, who have been quite critical of Boris Johnson publicly throughout his time as Prime Minister. But there's also, veteran backbenchers who are seen as more sort of right-wing free market, who are also critical of Boris, and even, the Mayites, the people who supported Theresa May. So it's not necessarily like it's one sort of big chunk of the party.
Georgia. It's interesting, Georgia, sorry to interrupt you. It's very interesting if you look at that debate this week, of course, where 100 Conservative backbenchers were against Boris Johnson. It's not just the usual suspects. It's not just the Steve Bakers and the Mark Harpers of this world. It's actually people like Damien Green, who was the deputy to Theresa May, effectively the deputy prime minister of this country, who'd be a very kind of pretty liberal, one nation conservative who voted against the government. But surely Boris Johnson is in serious trouble if this happens again. Or do you think that Christmas will be a time for cooling off and perhaps in the new year he can reset things?
Yeah, I think a lot of these stories, especially the Downing Street parties, breaking lockdown rules, I think things like that definitely are going to stick in people's mind going into the next election, just because of how the pandemic has obviously dominated everything. And let's be real, we're still not out of the pandemic. So I think that's probably another reason why no one else is sort of chomping at the bit to sort of be in Boris Johnson's shoes. Because think about it, going towards the next election, would you want to be having to defend everything the government has done up until this point? I don't think Rishi Sunak, he's quite young, even though he's very competent and he's actually well liked compared to Boris among party members and among the public right now. And he has actually, been heavily involved in the policy making of the pandemic too. But I don't think someone like him is sort of, really desperate to be leader right now. And I think you're correct that things like this are going to stick in the public's mind. But it sort of depends how that will affect things going forward, because obviously things change very fast. We don't know what could happen before the next election. But Christmas, okay, the headlines will probably die down, but it depends what happens, because if we, let's say, were to have another lockdown, I don't think that's going to go down too well among segments of the Tory
well,
party.
they're perhaps
in particular.
talking about that at the moment in Cobra. Of course, that meeting is being held today. Mike, perhaps if I could ask you two things. One, on the parties area specifically, someone was texted me to say, why aren't you talking about the fact that civil servants were holding them? Well, I think that it's widely accepted, although we'll know when Sue Gray, the senior civil servant, puts out her report, exactly who was there and why. But do you think that Simon Case, the cabinet secretary who's had to recuse himself from this report, could actually be thrown under a bus in some way in regard to these parties to take the focus off Boris Johnson? And the second thing I wanted to ask you is whether you think that people like Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss will be tainted by association. I remember when a very wise conservative grandee saying to me on one occasion, when Theresa May goes, it'll be someone from outside the cabinet who's the next Prime Minister. And of course it proved to be the case with Boris Johnson, although he'd served in the cabinet. So what do you make of those two issues, Mike?
Well, I mean, I think these Christmas parties seem to be finding about one or two more every day. I mean, it started with the one on the 18th of December, then we had the, in quotes, virtual quiz, where we suddenly found out that loads of them were hanging out in number 10. It was that photo with Boris Johnson with two other people when we weren't supposed to be socialised with anyone from outside our own households. And there've been many more. There was the one in Conservative Party HQ with Sean Bailey. So if they try and throw Simon Case under a bus for this, who apparently attended some drinks quite briefly, but he still shouldn't have done it, obviously, then I think the public just won't buy it. Just like this didn't go away when Allegra Stratton resigned, and I mean, she probably was right to resign, but nevertheless, she was not the only person joking about it in that briefing room. She was just the one on the camera. There were loads of other people in there. Nobody else has resigned, and nor has Boris Johnson. So I don't think this is going away. It's clearly cut through to the public. And I suspect it will still be an issue come the next election, because we've all lived this. I spent last Christmas here in this flat, on my own, apart from seeing people I was in a bubble with, and I obeyed the rules. And the vast majority of people in this country obeyed the rules as well. And we endured that for our own safety and for the safety of others.
Absolutely.
The fact that people did not do the same thing who told us to do that in the first place, it's deeply, deeply bad for all of us.
Absolutely. And we're just slightly running out of time. Mike, maybe you could tell us your thoughts on the tainted by association point in regard to Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. What do you make of that?
Well, we know that Rishi Sunak's department had some drinks as well. We don't yet know about Liz Truss's department. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But I suspect the public will swiftly forget which individuals were involved and which ones weren't. And it looks to me as if the whole Conservative Party and the government were having parties quite happily last December, while the rest of us were in lockdown. And I suspect that's going to be the view of the public as well. So yes, I think they are tainted by association. We don't know who the next Conservative Party leader will be. It may be one of those two. It may, as you say, be somebody from outside the cabinet. But of course, one problem the Conservatives have is they've been in power for 11 years. They've burned through a lot of, in quotes, talent in that time. And indeed, they got rid of a lot of their more talented MPs in the last Parliament, because they removed the whip from them. And so, of course, they then lost their seats. So they're in real trouble as they look to who their next leader is going to be, I think.
Very final thought, briefly, if you would, from Georgia, please. What do you make of the future for Boris Johnson?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a sort of a matter of time rather than when he will leave. And I think that the problem is, if this happens, if he's pushed out prior to the next general election, I think it's very confusing as to who would succeed him, because, like I'm saying, someone like Rishi Sunak, who is sort of the favourite, he wouldn't necessarily want to be leader at the next general election.
Oh, I think there are probably quite a few MPs who wouldn't mind picking up the if the ball came loose from the scrum, as Boris Johnson once said. Listen, thank you so much to both of you, Mike Buckley, journalist and campaigner, and Georgia Gilholy, who's a political reporter with politics.co.uk. Merry Christmas to you both.